from Europe. It's my pleasure to moderate this important session. Let me just first say that I am a great admirer of Vietnam and what this incredible nation has achieved over the last few years. I was working for a number of years in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, and we made a stellar observation, and that was when we measured output of education in most nations in the world. Because it may not have come as a big surprise that Singapore and South Korea and some parts of China were at the top of the outputs, but what I think really surprised everyone was that the fantastic achiever was Vietnam. Indeed, 15 years old in Vietnam performed better in education than 15 years old in any European nation, or indeed in the United States of America. And when I thought that, suggested that at the time of the Vietnam War, there would have been a laugh across the globe, I think. So it's a fantastic achievement. I visited Vietnam first time in 1979, just after the war. We went to Long Son to see the audience of the short border war between Vietnam and China, and it impressed us upon the enormous importance of peace. But of course, Vietnam those days was an incredibly poor nation, while now, according to the last statistics I saw, Vietnam is the second biggest rice exporter in the world and the second biggest coffee exporter in the world. So it's such fantastic achievements. And of course, based on these achievements, Vietnam will take an important place in the world, and South China Sea issues with China, Vietnam, and so many other actors are much higher on the global agenda. We have a very good title for our session, which is Looking Back to a Brighter Future for the South China Sea. When you study history, you know that history can always be used as a raw material for conflicts. Conflict entrepreneurs always find something in history to fuel new conflicts in the present. But history can also tell us the lessons how to keep peace, how to work together, how to reconcile, how to find joint systems and joint expressions of solidarity. So let's use this history lesson to find all the ideas as to how we can keep peace in the future and how the nations around the South China Sea can prosper and how they can prosper together. We have a great panel to discuss how we can look into the past to create an even brighter future. There are 4 great speakers. The first is Carl Cha. Carl Cha is an independent researcher. He's of Chinese origin, but has spent most of his adult life in the United States. I followed you on social media, and your social media postings are very, very interesting and a great source of knowledge and perspectives on the relationship between China and the outside world. You are a graduate of the Caltech, and you are hosting the Silk and Steel podcast, which is focusing on China and the surrounding regions, history, culture, and politics. Please, Carl Cha, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to listening to your perspectives.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I will now present my slide, which I prepared for this occasion. I understand I only have 10 minutes, so I will try to be brief as possible. Oh, I didn't share my screen. Just a minute. Share my screen. And okay, so now you can see my screen. I will present my slide, and I will try to go through as quick as possible. The slide is the South China Sea from Chinese perspective. China is one of the most important claimant to the South China Sea. So I think it's important to understand the Chinese perspective to the South China Sea dispute. The dispute over sovereignty in archipelago are settled according to the Palma case under international law. And Palma's held that it's quite natural that establishment of sovereignty may be the outcome of a slow evolution of progressive intensification of state control. And China tried to establish a legal claim of sovereignty over Shisa, or aka Parasols, and Nansa, aka Spratly Islands, based on the historical records. And there have been unearthing of Han Dynasty pottery on the Taiping Island, aka Itu Aba, in the Spratly Islands. The Southern Northern Dynasty's 6-year jug on the Paracel Islands, and a whole host of potteries, of tools of various sorts unearthed in the Paracels. As early as the 13th century record, Song Dynasty record, Zhu Fangzi, there was a mention of 10,000 li stretch of sand and 10,000 li of stone pool embeds south of Highland Islands. And some say this actually refers to Paracel and the Spratly Islands respectively. And then during the Ming Dynasty, the Admiral Zheng He's fleet sails through the South China Sea, and they have mapped out the Paracel and the Spratlys. This is attested to by the various shipwrecks carrying the Chinese porcelain in the South China Sea. And in the Qing Dynasty map of 1810, it's marked this 10,000 li stretch of sand and 10,000 li stone pools / beds on the map. Now, by late 19th century, the Europeans start to show up. According to the book, Where in the World is the Philippines, by Debating its National History by Rudolf Sorvino. In 1883, the Chinese protested against the German survey of the Paracel and Spratlys. This is a result of the Chinese defeat by the French in the Sino-French War. And China was compelled to sign a peace treaty with France, which incidentally actually assigned the Paracel and Spratlys to China. In fact, in 1909, the Guangdong fleet under Admiral Li Zun visited the Paracel Islands along with 170 naval officers. They inspected 15 islands, set up stone tablets engraved with the name of islands, and hoisted flag and fired a salute as an assertion of Chinese sovereignty. At this time, French did not lodge any protests because they largely acknowledged that the South China Sea Islands are Chinese territory. And this is asserted by the South China Sea in the Age of European Decline in the Modern Asian Studies 2006, that from 1910 to 1920s, France largely agrees the Paracel Islands were under Chinese sovereignty. Therefore, France did not protest in 1921 when the government in Guangdong province declared Paracel to be under administration of Highland Islands. And again, and this would change in 1930s as the Japanese encroachment of China began, and the France starting to get nervous that the Japan will start moving into South China Sea. So according to the China's claim of sovereignty over Spratlys and Paracel Islands, a historical legal perspective published by Case Western Reserve Journal of International Law, this was when France officially claimed South China Sea Islands, the Paracel and Spratlys, and they sent their warship there to enforce their claim. What they found, though, according to a 1933 French publication, the French found that only Chinese, the natives from Highland Island, lived there. At the time, there were residents on the Southwest Island. There were residents living in T2 Island. 2 of them were children. This is the Spratly Islands. There were residents living on Spratly Island. On Low Island, there were remains of a Chinese shrine, huts, and a well. On Itu Aba Island, although nobody is visible, a Chinese tablet is discovered with an inscription that a shipment of food was made to this island. So that's what French found. So French put a weather station, but they largely left the Chinese fishermen alone on the island. Make us long story short, the French occupation of Ireland was ended by the Japanese during the World War II. And at the end of Japanese surrender, China reasserted the claim to South China Sea. In fact, the Republic of China, with the help of United States, sent its fleet to South China Sea and they landed on the Ituaba island of Spratly. So they rename it to Taiping Island, naming after their flagship. And in 1947, the Republic of China government actually printed out their formal claim over South China Sea. This is a famous 11 dash line all around South China Sea. This is also the claim that was inherited by the People's Republic of China after the Chinese Civil War, except that through bilateral negotiation between China and Vietnam, two dash line was removed from the Gulf of Tonkins. So now it's just 9 dash line. This is kind of the historical perspective. It's important to also to note neither PRC government nor the KMT government on Taiwan was allowed to attend the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951 that ended the settlement of World War II because they're in a civil war. However, KMT government on Taiwan did sign a separate treaty with Japan regarding these islands on April 29th, 1952. Now, what I said before, that's the Chinese perspective. Now, this is a different perspective put forth by the Diplomacy on the Rocks, China and Other Claimants in South China Sea. This is a speech given at the Watson Institute of International Studies, Brown University, by the former US Ambassador, Chas Freeman. And what he said is, well, it's actually normal for the claimants to reinterpret history to fit their own to conform to the once foreign Westphalian notion of sovereignty. But it doesn't really matter which fishermen or how long they have spent on these islands, because it has nothing to do with asserting or violating sovereignty, because back then, those are not the operating concept in Asia. However, he did point out that China is the first to assert sovereignty in the modern sense to the South China Islands, when it formally objected to France's effort to incorporate them into French Indochina during the 1884 and 85 Sino-French War. And Chinese maps have since consistently shown China's claim, first as a solid and then as a dotted line. And then you repeat the same history of how 1930s, when France formally claimed the islands, they found they built a weather station but did not disturb the Chinese fishermen, and then Japanese took it over from the France. And then in 1945, according to the Cairo and Potsdam Declaration, and with American help, the Republic of China accepts the Japanese surrender on Taiwan, and including Paracel and Spratly Islands. And this is what I covered just previously. The ROC actually established a garrison on both the Woody, now renamed Yongxin Islands, in the Paracel, and the Taiping Paracel in Taiping Island in the Spratlys. French protested, but they failed to dislodge the Chinese troops. So instead, they set up a small camp on the Pathol Island in the southwestern part of the Paracel archipelago. And in 1950, as a result of the Chinese Civil War, nationalist troops withdrew from Highland Island, and they also withdrew the garrison from the Paracel and Spratly to Taiwan. And also at the same time in 1954, France ceased to be a factor, because by then you recognize the independence of both South and North Vietnam, and withdrew from Indochina. However, in 1956, a Filipino businessman, Tomas Cloma, put his own claim on all of South China Sea. That prompted in 1956 that prompted the both People's Republic of China to send a garrison in Woody Island in Paracels, and also the Republic of China on Taiwan to send a garrison on Taiping Island in Spratlys. And in 1956, North Vietnam formally accepted the Paracel and Spratly Islands were historically Chinese. But at the same time, the South Vietnam, they reopened the abandoned French camp on the Sang Hu Island, or the Pathol Island, and announced it has annexed Paracel Archipelago and Spratly. But because of the ongoing civil war, South Vietnam they actually did not occupy the Spratly Islands at the time. They only had this presence on the Pathol or Sang Hu Islands. And it's important to note on the Soviet War Atlas of 1967, the Paracel Islands were actually named with the Chinese name Xisha Qundao. This is the map of Soviet map. And okay. And so what is China's strongest claim? Well, in 1958, North Vietnam Premier Phan Bang Dong actually wrote an official letter to the PRC Premier Zhou Enlai, arguably acknowledging China's sovereignty over the island. In the letter, he stated his country recognized and supports the official PRC declaration on September 4th, 1958, of its territorial sea of 12 nautical miles. And in that declaration, China has asserted this provision applies to all territories of PRC, including the Paracel Islands and all other islands belonging to China. And in 1959, PRC actually set up the office of Xisha, Nansha, and Zhongsha Islands on the woody island of Paracels, and neither North nor South Vietnam protested against. So this leads to 1974, the Battle of Paracels, when South Vietnam, which had control of Paddle Island, discover activity of Chinese fishermen and try to evict them. That led to the conflict between South Vietnam and China, which where South Vietnam was defeated and China gained the control of the entire Paracel Islands. Around the same year, however, South Vietnam sent its garrison to station on several of the Spratly Islands. And after the unification of Vietnam, the socialist Vietnam government they put forth the same claim on South China Sea as the South Vietnam government. So what we ended up with is this: it's a different claim lines in South China Sea. The red, the cow tongue is the China claim line, and this blue line is the Vietnam claim line with a different reefs and atolls occupied by different group of people. And this is a close-up map. This is lead up to the present. So in 1988, China actually fought a brief naval skirmish with Vietnam, where it grabbed several of these atolls, whereas the government on Taiwan, the so-called Republic of China government, still occupy Itu Aba, or the Taiping Island. Now, this is important because Taiping Island is the only island that would qualify under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, qualify as human habitable, which would mean that you will be entitled to its own EEZ, exclusive economic zone. None of these other islets, reefs, they may be entitled to a territorial sea, but they will not be entitled EEZ under the UNICO's convention. I think this wraps up my talk. I just wanted to give a brief historical overview and to give the claim from the Chinese perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Char, for this very interesting overview of Chinese claims and Chinese interests in the South China Sea, starting with the Han Dynasty, I think, going through Song and up to recent developments. I think it was very, very interesting. And we'll, of course, come back to this in the discussion after the other speakers. The next speaker is Dr. Bill Hayton. He is an associate fellow at the Asia-Pacific program and the Chatham House since 2015. He has worked as a journalist with the BBC News for a long period of time and has been reporting from Vietnam and from Myanmar and from other parts of Asia. A couple of months back, I had the pleasure of reading this book, which is his book. It's called The Invention of China. It may be provocative to some Chinese nationalists for sure, but it also gives interesting perspectives to the debate on Chinese history and identity and culture. So recommend people to read this book. We've also written extensively about Vietnam, and I understand that in the pipeline you have a book called The Brief History of Vietnam, which will be published next year. And I can already now tell you I will be one of the buyers of that book. I will read it with great interest. Bill Hayton, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for those kind words. And I'm very pleased to hear that you enjoyed the book. Thanks to everybody at the DAV for their invitation and for their assistance today. My thanks to Carl.
And for all speakers, please stick to the 10 at the very maximum 15 minutes deadline, because otherwise we will not have any discussion afterwards. And I think people will have questions they want to ask. So please, Hayton.
Thank you. My thanks to Carl for reminding us of the gulf in historical knowledge between the version taught in Chinese schools and found on Wikipedia, and that now understood by active historians and researchers over the past 20 years. I fear that Carl has demonstrated the difficulties of relying on Chas Freeman for a sound understanding of South China Sea history. Also an honor to share the stage with Professor Chimilier-Gentraux, whose book on the Paracels and the Spratlys, the English edition is now 21 years old, led me to do the research about which I'm going to talk today. Now, for some time, I've been interested in the emergence of the various claims, the history of how they came to be in the South China Sea. And for too long, a lot of nonsense has been talked about ancient claims, and I've been searching for evidence. So we know, as Carl pointed out, that there's documented evidence that the Qing state made a claim to the Paracels in 1909. But there's always been a question about whether this was the very first claim. And I think I'm now able to say that it was. My hunt started with Professor Chimilier-Gentraux's book, which contains the text of a diplomatic telegram sent in response to that Chinese claim in 1909 by the French consul in Canton, Guangzhou. He reminds his boss in this telegram of an incident 10 years earlier, during which he says the Chinese government rejected a claim for compensation for a looted shipwreck on the grounds that the Paracels were not part of the Chinese Empire. This story then entered the narrative of French and subsequently Vietnamese claims to the Paracels, but it seemed that no one ever checked the evidence for the story. All we had was an assertion from a decade later. Until now, the story concerns not one, but two shipwrecks. The first, the German SS Bellona, was wrecked on North Reef in September 1894. The second, the Japanese-owned Himeji Maru, was wrecked on Bombay Reef in November 1896, 2 years later. All the crews were rescued, but the cargoes were not. Both ships were carrying cargoes of copper. Both were insured at Lloyd's of London through the British-owned but Hong Kong-based companies, the Bellona by the China Traders Insurance Company and the Himeji Maru by the Canton Insurance Office. Bad weather prevented the salvaging of the wrecks, and in both cases, what might be euphemistically called fishing crews from Hainan helped themselves to the contents of the wrecks. And this is where the diplomatic arguments began. In the 1890s, Hainan was a marginal place. There was minimal international trade and very few officials. This picture shows about half of the entire foreign population of the island in 1898. Two British officers commanded a revenue cutter of the Qing Imperial Maritime Customs Service. There was a British consul, P.S. O'Brien Butler, a French consul, and a Mr. Otto, who represented a German shipping company, Schomburg. All of them would play a role in the disputes over the shipwrecks. At the time, Hainan was well known as a haven for smugglers, pirates, triads, Ming loyalists, and others who lived beyond the law. There were also fishing boats, including some that would make journeys regularly as far south as Borneo. The British surveyor James Horsburgh noted in the 1810s that some would go on fishing expeditions for 2 months as far as what are now called the Spratlys, sometimes leaving 1 or 2 crew members on the Paracels to collect sea cucumbers before collecting them later. But the question that the diplomats would soon face was whether there was any official interest in these islands. Now, we don't have enough time today to look at exactly what happened after the shipwrecks, but by early 1899, the insurance companies felt they had a case against the Qing authorities for, at a minimum, negligence in ignoring the theft of the copper ingots, as we can see from these pictures. These were from the original insurance documents at the time, and at a maximum facilitating the smuggling of the copper out of Hainan in collusion with the thieves. They petitioned the Governor General of the two Guangs, Guangzhou and Guangxi, demanding compensation of almost 190,000 Hong Kong dollars. Arguments about who was responsible for preventing the looting and accusations that local officials were complicit went back and forth between the insurers, British diplomats, and Qing officials for many months. This comes to the crucial letter. On the 14th of April, 1898, Tan Zhonglin, the Governor General of the two Guangs, wrote to the British consul in Guangzhou denying responsibility for the lost cargoes. A transcript of this letter, retained by the British consulate, is now available in the UK National Archives. Viceroy Tan asks, "Da hai mang mang, kong he bao hu?" How can we protect what is in the high seas? You'll see the full letter on the left-hand side, and then I've highlighted the text on the right-hand side. The Viceroy is saying, in effect, that the paracels are not his responsibility because they are part of Da hai mang mang, which could be translated in this context with the colloquial expression, the deep blue sea. The argument continued for more than a year afterwards and was escalated to the British legation in Beijing and the Zongli Yamen, the Qing dynasty's foreign office. On the 8th of August, 1899, the Yamen wrote to Henry Bax Ironside, the secretary of the British legation, again to deny the claim. And here's the letter. Or here's a translation of the letter, I should say. The original was probably written on a scroll, which was too bulky to store. So what we have left are the transcriptions and the translations. In the British translation of this letter, and it's over 2 pages, which I put on the sides here, and then I've highlighted the key section. The Zongli Yamen, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, says responsibility for compensation for the loss due to these unfortunate shipwrecks on the high seas lies with the insurance companies. Now, further research is required to identify the exact phrase used in the Chinese version, although it seems more than likely that the Yamen just repeated the same wording that the Viceroy had used the year before. Now, it's worth noting that at this time, the British government wanted China to recognize that it had responsibility for the paracels so that it would settle the insurance claim. As a result, I don't believe that whoever transcribed or translated these letters had any interest in minimizing a Chinese territorial claim, rather the opposite. What is striking is that throughout this dispute, the Qing authorities were at pains to deny responsibility for or even knowledge of the Paracel Islands. An interesting element of the correspondence is that the way that the Chinese officials routinely refer to the shipwrecks as having occurred in the Qi-Ju-Yang, literally the Seven Island Sea. But where is the Qi-Ju-Yang? Investigating this question shines a fascinating light on an important aspect of the history of Chinese knowledge about the South China Sea and the misunderstandings that occurred as a result. If we look at this map, which was published in 1870 and presumably copied from foreign originals, we can see that there's absolutely no mention of the paracels to the southeast of Hainan Island. There are, however, 2 groups of islands marked just to the northeast of Hainan. The upper one doesn't actually exist. If we zoom in, we can see a name, Qizhouyang, describing an area at the mouth of the Hainan Strait between Hainan and the mainland. But there's also another group of islands slightly to the south, but without a name. As we can see from this later Chinese map, these islands are named the Qizhu Dao, literally the 7 islands in English, but known internationally as the Taya Islands. Taya comes from the Malay word meaning 7. These islands were notorious during the 18th and 19th century as a hiding place for pirates and smugglers. If we superimpose a modern satellite photograph, we can see that these islands are only around 25 kilometers from the coast of Hainan. They're about 300 meters north of the paracels. However, the meaning of Qizhouyang appears to have shifted considerably over time. We can see the name printed on many maps from many time periods covering very different areas. As late as 1933, during the diplomatic correspondence after the French annexation of the Spratly Islands, and I should say that China did not protest the French annexation of the Spratly Islands in 1933, the Chinese Foreign Ministry then is still talking about the Qizhouyang, but apparently without understanding where it is, or the difference between the Taya, or the paracels, or the Spratlys. As late as 1980, the Chinese Foreign Ministry was conciting documents mentioning the Qizhouyang as evidence for a claim to the paracels, even though they are quite separate groups of islands. This confusion seems to have characterized Chinese responses to disputes in the South China Sea for decades. So what does this all mean for our understanding of Chinese claims in the South China Sea? My first conclusion, taken together with other evidence about which I've written in the past, is that we can now confidently state that no Chinese state ever made a claim to sovereignty or any other form of administration in the Paracel Islands before 1909. Yes, fishers fished and traders traded, but no officials thought about owning or administering the rocks and reefs until the early 20th century. And secondly, we need more research on the history of the Chinese name Qijiuyang and what it meant in different time periods. Two scholars, Johannes Kurtz and Roderick Tack, have made some important progress, but a little more is needed. This would, I think, allow us to clear up yet another misunderstanding about the history of the South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill Hayton. We got new nuances from your intervention. Carl Shaw brought Chinese perspectives as Chinese relationship to these islands throughout history, and you made the claim that there have not been the strong desire for sovereignty of the island. So, but these may not contradict each other. They may also complement the perspectives. The next speaker is Monique Chemelier-Gendreau. She is an emeritus professor of public law and political science at the University of Paris, Diderot. She used to be a UNESCO Office of International Standards and Legal Affairs and worked on a number of cases there brought before the Administrative Tribunal of the International Labour Organization. And then she will also go into history and to what happened in San Francisco conference on the South China Sea. Professor, you will speak in French, I understand. So if there are participants who cannot follow your French intervention, please turn into the English or other language interpretation channels. Please, the floor is yours.
Merci. On m'entend? Oui. Alors, je remercie les organisateurs de cette conférence de m'avoir invité sur un sujet que je travaille dans mes recherches universitaires depuis maintenant plusieurs décennies. On m'a demandé de parler plus particulièrement du traité de San Francisco de 1951 et de ses conséquences sur la situation des formations terrestres en mer de Chine du Sud. Alors, la conférence internationale qui s'est tenue à San Francisco en 1951 avait pour but de fixer les conditions de la paix avec le Japon suite à sa défaite dans la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Elle n'avait pas à son ordre du jour la question du titre de souveraineté sur les formations maritimes des Paracels et des Spratlys. C'est postérieurement à la signature du traité qu'une certaine utilisation des travaux de cette conférence a pu prêter à confusion. Alors, pour clarifier les choses sur ce point, je rappellerai d'abord quelle était la situation concrète de ces îles au moment de la négociation du traité. J'exposerai ensuite les circonstances dans lesquelles ces îles ont été évoquées au cours de la conférence, alors qu'elles ne sont pas mentionnées dans l'acte final. Enfin, je dirai un mot des circonstances postérieures, notamment du traité séparé de paix entre le Japon et la Chine, là encore pour dissiper certaines confusions. Je dois préciser ici que je travaille depuis donc des décennies essentiellement sur les documents d'archives, les archives de l'École française d'Extrême-Orient, les archives diplomatiques françaises et surtout les archives militaires qui sont les plus objectives parce que quand les militaires font des rapports à leurs supérieurs hiérarchiques, ils le font pour des raisons stratégiques en disant l'objectivité des choses, ils n'ont pas d'arrière-pensée diplomatique. Alors, premier point, quelle était la situation des îles en 1951 quand s'ouvre la conférence de la paix? Les formations émergentes de la mer de l'Est, car comme vous le savez, la plupart d'entre elles ne sont pas des îles. Ces formations avaient fait l'objet de la part des empereurs d'Annam, et cela dès le XVIIIe siècle, d'une prise de possession qui correspondait aux exigences du droit international de cette époque. Et là, nous avons des documents historiques extrêmement nombreux qui attestent des actes d'administration effectués alors par les empereurs qui envoyaient régulièrement des missions de marins dans les îles, notamment en fonction de la mousson. Au XIXe siècle, la France assure sa domination coloniale sur ce qu'elle nomme l'Indochine. Elle prend alors connaissance, mais tardivement, de l'administration des îles par les empereurs. Et elle va réaliser peu à peu l'intérêt de ces formations. Elle va donc affirmer sa souveraineté en continuité avec les droits qui avaient été acquis par l'Annam. N'oublions pas que l'Annam était sous un protectorat, c'est-à-dire que le royaume d'Annam persistait quand même sous la domination française. Elle le fera par 2 proclamations de souveraineté distinctes pour chacun des 2 ensembles d'îles, avec rattachement administratif à la colonie de Cochinchine. Cela a fait l'objet d'une publication au journal officiel français en 1933 pour les Spratlais, en 1938 pour les Paracels. Il faut rappeler aussi que la Chine n'avait commencé à s'intéresser aux Paracels, comme cela vient d'être rappelé par l'orateur qui m'a précédé, qu'à partir de 1909, sans toutefois jamais les occuper avant la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Alors, elle n'a occupé, mais très temporairement, que de 1947 à 1950, l'île boisée aux Paracels. C'est ainsi qu'en 1951, les rapports des militaires français prouvent qu'il n'y avait plus aucune présence chinoise sur les îles. Le départ du détachement chinois est confirmé par la presse de Taipei en mai 1950 et il ne sera pas remplacé par les forces du gouvernement communiste. Après la guerre, peu à peu, les troupes françaises vont être remplacées par des contingents vietnamiens. Cette relève des troupes est effectuée en octobre 1950. Elle est décrite en détail dans les archives militaires françaises. Pour ce qui est du Japon, il y avait encouragé des demandes de concession de la part d'entreprises d'exploitation des phosphates et sa marine va, à partir de 1938, croiser dans les eaux des Paracels. Mais pour les Paracels, cela n'est pas accompagné d'une réclamation de souveraineté. Quant aux Spratlais, il n'y a pas de trace d'un intérêt de la Chine pour ces formations avant les années 50 et elle ne s'y implantera par la force pour la première fois seulement en 1988. Il est intéressant de constater que la presse chinoise, lors de la prise de possession des Spratlais par la France en 1933, témoigne d'une certaine ignorance des Chinois de la localisation de ces territoires et il parle même de la nécessité d'enquêter pour savoir si ces territoires sont ou non inhabités ou habités et par qui. Le Japon avait manifesté de l'intérêt dans les années précédant la Seconde Guerre mondiale, comme pour les Paracels, d'abord sur le plan d'implantation commerciale, exploitation des phosphates, mais à partir de 1938, dans le cadre de la politique expansionniste nippone, le Japon affirme une revendication et finira par prendre un acte d'annexion des Spratlais le 30 mars 1939. La revendication des Philippines émerge alors, mais sans grande précision. Enfin, on notera l'absence de mention de ces 2 groupes d'îles lors de la conférence du Caire de 1943. Pourtant, le général Chiang Kai-shek est présent aux côtés de ses alliés américains et britanniques. Il y est question de la suite des opérations militaires contre le Japon et notamment de lui faire rendre les territoires usurpés. Il est même précisé quels sont les territoires à rendre à la Chine et les autres. À aucun moment, il n'est question des formations de la mer de l'Est. Le maréchal chinois ne les évoque pas. Alors, j'en viens à mon second point. Comment les Paracels et les Spratlais ont été évoqués durant la conférence de San Francisco 1951. Lors de la conférence qui a précédé la signature du traité, la Chine est divisée. Mao Tse-tung est au pouvoir sur la Chine continentale, tandis que la Chine nationaliste est repliée à Formose. Les puissances invitantes, les États-Unis et la Grande-Bretagne, ne sont pas d'accord entre elles quant à savoir laquelle des 2 Chines invitées. Finalement, aucune des 2 Chines ne sera présente à la conférence. En revanche, Les États associés dans le cadre de l'Union française, c'est-à-dire le Vietnam, le Laos et le Cambodge, sont conviés. Dès le mois de mai 1951, le gouvernement de la Chine communiste adresse une note au gouvernement soviétique, qui est son allié, lequel fait partie des invités. Cette note est très critique sur le projet de traité, déplorant que le retour à la Chine de Formose et des pescadors ne soit pas invoqué. Mais cette première note, donc mai 1951, ne parle pas des îles Paracel et des Spratly. C'est 4 mois plus tard, le 15 août 1951, que le gouvernement chinois revendique sa souveraineté sur ces formations par une note du Premier ministre. Alors, au cours de la conférence de San Francisco, le délégué soviétique, Andrei Gromyko, va présenter un amendement au terme duquel le Japon reconnaîtrait la souveraineté de la Chine sur les 2 groupes d'îles. Mais la mise à l'ordre du jour de cet amendement fut rejetée par la conférence. 46 États se prononcèrent contre et 3 pour l'URSS et ses alliés, la Pologne et la Tchécoslovaquie. Au lendemain de la conférence, le 9 septembre 1951, Andrei Gromyko, à l'occasion d'une conférence de presse, proteste contre le fait que le traité constituait une violation des droits de la Chine à propos de Taïwan, des pescadors et des Paracel et des Spratly. Mais cette protestation diplomatique ne pouvait pas avoir d'effet de droit puisqu'il avait été décidé de ne pas examiner l'amendement soviétique et que ce refus avait été acté dans les délibérations de la conférence. À la tribune de la conférence de San Francisco, le premier ministre du gouvernement vietnamien de Bao Dai, Tran Van Hu, fait le 7 septembre une déclaration sur la souveraineté du Vietnam sur les 2 archipels, je le cite, « Nous affirmons nos droits sur les îles Spratly et Paracel qui, de tout temps, ont fait partie du Vietnam. » Aucune délégation n'intervient pour s'opposer à la déclaration du Vietnam. Le traité de paix avec le Japon est signé à San Francisco le 8 septembre 1951 par 49 États, l'Union soviétique, la Pologne et la Tchécoslovaquie ayant refusé leur signature. La France signe pour sa part le traité sans y apporter de réserve. Au terme de l'article 2.f, le Japon renonce à tout droit, titres et prétentions sur les îles Spratly et les îles Paracel. Le texte n'indique aucune dévolution de ces territoires. Les territoires restitués par le Japon mais dévolus à la Chine font l'objet d'un autre paragraphe qui ne comporte pas les îles en question. Alors, on ne peut pas, selon les règles d'interprétation du droit international, tirer argument du silence du traité de 1951 sur la dévolution des îles pour prétendre que ce traité aurait accordé des droits à la Chine sur les Paracel et les Spratly. Le sens des mots, le contexte du traité, son objet et son but vont dans une seule direction, les îles sont retirées à la mainmise japonaise. Mais si le traité n'a pas dit à qui doivent aller ces îles, ses travaux préparatoires indiquent la volonté d'une très large majorité d'États dans le sens d'un refus d'une dévolution à la Chine. Dès lors, au moment où s'achève la conférence de San Francisco, le 8 septembre 1951, le titre ancien de l'ANAM avait été repris par la France, État protecteur. Il a été de nouveau publiquement revendiqué par le Vietnam, sans que cela fasse l'objet de contestations par les États présents. Et parallèlement, la revendication chinoise, transmise à la tribune de la conférence, a été rejetée. Dans les mois qui suivent, le texte du traité est discuté dans les instances françaises avant la ratification. C'est ainsi qu'il vient en débat à l'Assemblée de l'Union française le 25 mars 1952 pour une demande d'avis. M. Nguyen Quoc Su, délégué vietnamien et rapporteur de la Commission des relations extérieures, rappelle à cette occasion les droits du Vietnam. Et au cours du même débat, Maurice Schumann, secrétaire d'État aux Affaires étrangères français, affirme l'appartenance de ces territoires au domaine de l'Union française. Alors, un mot pour un troisième point très rapide sur les circonstances postérieures et sur le traité bilatéral entre le Japon et la Chine. Quelques mois après San Francisco, un traité bilatéral est signé entre la République de Chine et le Japon. Il est signé à Taipei le 28 avril 1952. Et pour ce qui concerne les paracels et les spratlets, l'article 2 de ce traité sino-japonais est rédigé comme suit. Il est reconnu qu'en vertu de l'article 2 du traité de paix avec le Japon conclu en la ville de San Francisco le 8 septembre 1951, le Japon a renoncé à tout droit, titres et revendications sur Formose et les Pescadores, ainsi que sur les îles Spratly et les îles Paracels. Cet article 2 est suivi par un article 3 qui concerne Formose et les Pescadores, et notamment la question des habitants, des droits des personnes. Le texte qui résulte de la négociation entre les deux pays fait donc mention de l'abandon par le Japon des îles Paracels et Spratly, ce qui est étrange car rien ne conduisait à mentionner ces îles dans ce traité. Mais on trouve l'explication de ce fait dans les archives diplomatiques françaises. L'ambassadeur de France explique que le projet japonais ne visait d'abord dans son article 2 que Formose et les Pescadores. Mais les autorités de Taipei avaient insisté pour que mention soit faite des archipels en question et les délégués japonais avaient fini par céder. Mais il s'agissait seulement de confirmer la renonciation du Japon, déjà stipulée à San Francisco, sans prendre position en ce qui concerne l'appartenance juridique actuelle ou la dévolution future des territoires mentionnés. Or, la situation créée par le traité de San Francisco, comme je l'ai rappelé, était parfaitement claire, et le choix des termes utilisés en 1952 ne modifiait en rien ce qui avait été fait en 1951. Donc, cette confirmation permet d'affirmer que le traité de paix bilatéral ne peut pas être analysé comme procédant à une dévolution conventionnelle des deux groupes d'îles à la Chine. Et d'ailleurs, je dois ajouter un dernier point, le gouvernement français, qui était inquiet qu'une ambiguïté puisse subsister, suggère alors qu'une mise au point soit préparée par un communiqué commun des deux gouvernements, français et japonais. Et il y a eu donc à ce moment-là un échange de lettres qu'on trouve dans les archives, dans lequel le Japon admet, à la demande de la France, que le traité bilatéral avec la Chine ne voulait rien dire de plus que le traité multilatéral de 1951 et qu'il n'a aucune signification relativement à la dévolution des paracels et des spratlets. Donc voilà le bilan du point de vue du droit international que l'on peut tirer de ce moment historique.
Professor John, can I ask
Yes.
you to move? Can I ask you to move to the
It's-
conclusion because we need
yes.
time also for the question and
Yes,
answer session. So
excuse me, Mr.
take your time
President.
and move to the
It's my
conclusion,
conclusion. It's my conclusion. At the end of, à la fin des deux traités de paix, la Chine a confirmé ses prétentions, mais celles-ci n'ont pas été prises en considération. On se retrouve donc devant la situation antérieure au traité de 1951. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Professor, for these interesting perspectives, focusing in on what happened in San Francisco in 1951 and the time before and after that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are moving also to question and answer session. The last speaker is Wu Haidang. He's an ocean law and policy senior research fellow at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. He has wide experience in international law, law of the seas, international environmental law, and protection of the marine environment. He has focused on Southeast Asia and worked with legal service, diplomacy, and academia. Please, Dr. Wu Haidang, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, can you see me and hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear, and we can see you well.
The 1950s were a very interesting period of time. It was a time when most of humanity started to enjoy long-term peace after two bloody world wars. It was also the time when another kind of war started, the Cold War. It is also the time when independence movement in the colonies gained momentum. But most importantly, in 1955 was the year of birth of two important men without whom we cannot make our presentation today, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Brief, the 1950s was a very important period of time. So during this important period of time, what happened to the Hoàng Sa or Paracels and Trường Sa or Spratlys? Mr. Chair, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let's go back on the time with me and have a look at what happened in the Paracels and Spratlys in the 1950s. In the 1950s, the Paracels and the Spratlys were like a paradise, a peaceful paradise, with no massive land reclamation, no big airport, only French and Vietnamese living together in harmony with nature. At that time, the Paracels and the Spratlys were claimed by 7 claimants. France and Vietnam together, of course, China, Taiwan, Japan, the United Kingdom of Mr. Bill Hayton, and last but not least, Mr. Morton Meads. I'm sure you're wondering, who is this Morton Meads? Well, he's an American citizen who claims the Spratlys not for the sake of the United States, but for himself. He claimed that the Spratlys were discovered by his grandfather, who established there a kingdom of a very beautiful name, the Kingdom of Humanity. And he is the crown prince of this kingdom. And the place where he put his claim was also very special, the United States Stock Exchange Commission. So in order to understand the San Francisco Treaty, we need to know about Japan's journey into the Paracels and the Spratlys. It was a short but eventful love story. From 1917, the first Japanese companies started to survey the Paracels and the Spratlys for economic exploitation, and many of them asked the Japanese government to declare sovereignty over them. The most important effort came from Lhasa Phosphate Company from Ryukyu in Osaka, which in 1924 built dormitories for 200 workers engaging in fishery and guano collection in Ituba Island. In 1927, the Consul General of Japan in Hanoi requested the government of Indochina to provide documents relating to the ownership of the Spratlys on a personal title. In 1938, Japan proceeded to occupy Woody Island and send ships to Ituaba. France protested. In 1939, Japan officially annexed Paracels and Spratlys. France proposed to take the matter to international arbitration, but Japan refused. 1940 to 1945, Japan evicted French and Annamite garrisons in the Paracels and Spratlys. 1942 to 1945, Japan built weather stations, listening posts, and submarine bases on the two islands. And finally, in 1951, with the San Francisco Treaty, Japan renounced sovereignty claim of the Paracels and Spratlys. Now let's focus on the San Francisco Treaty. And here I would like to rectify two misunderstandings. The first misunderstanding that I would like to rectify is I completely concur with Professor Monique Chaumilet-Gendreau that the San Francisco Treaty does not recognize the sovereignty over the Paracels and Spratlys to any claimant. The second misunderstanding that I would like to rectify is the San Francisco Treaty does not make the Spratlys trusted territories. Now, this argument is developed by Mr. Carlos Garcia, then Vice President and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, who later became President of the Philippines. He said in the 1970s that the Spratlys is a de facto trusted territory open to economic exploitation and settlement by any citizen of any allied power. There's no such a thing as de facto trusted territory. However, his argument has some, I must say, attraction, because if you look at the United Nations Charter, Article 77, it defines trusted territories as territories detached from enemy states as a result of the Second World War. However, a very important condition is missing in order to the Spratleys to become treaty territory is there's no treatyship agreement concluded, and that is the most important condition to become a treaty territory. If you look back at the history from 1945, when the treaty territory regime started, until 1993, when it ended, there are 11 treaty territories created all over the world. All of them have a treatyship agreement recognized by the United Nations General Assembly or the United Nations Security Council, and none of them was the Spratleys. Now, let's talk about Vietnam's position on sovereignty over the Paracel and Spratleys. The consistent position of Vietnam is the first country that established sovereignty over the Paracel and Spratleys, and it's the only country that continuously and peacefully administrates these two archipelagos in accordance with international law. So what does international law say about acquisition of sovereignty? So according to international law, there are two modes of acquisitions of sovereignty. The first is acquisition of sovereignty by discovery, followed by effective occupation, applicable to territories without master or terra nullius. The second mode is acquisition by prescription, followed by acquiescence, applicable to territories with a master. In any way, the occupation acts must be done by state representatives and not by private individuals like fishermen. And finally, the acquisition of sovereignty by the use of force is illegal. Now, according to the evidence provided by Vietnam, Vietnam has established sovereignty over the Paracel and Spratleys as early as the 15th century. At that time, the Nguyen Lots, which are the rulers of the South Vietnam, established the Hoàng Sa militia fleet or Paracel militia fleet in order to exploit the Paracel and the Spratleys. And by exploitation, I mean every year they send ships there to collect natural resources, to collect merchandise from wrecks, to undertake different measurements and to build different structures on those features. Later on, the King of Vietnam also provided protection for merchant ships against typhoon, against pirates, of course, and then he taxed those ships. These activities of the Paracel fleet or Hoàng Sa fleet were recorded in official documents of the court of Vietnam. At that time, the Vietnamese court used ancient Chinese. So let me read to you a translation of an extract of such a official document. We call it in Vietnamese Châu Bản, which translated roughly as official note, with sometimes with the king comments or the king mark on it. So the extract read as follows: 13 July 1837, 17th year of Minh Mạng reign, we, Hà Duy Phiên and Lý Văn Phúc, under instructions by His Majesty the King, in the past, Royal Marine, Royal Guard, and soldiers from two provinces of Bình Định and Quảng Ngãi were sent to the Paracels on a surveying mission. Now they have returned, except for the Royal Marine Phạm Văn Biện, Palace Vũ Văn Hùng, Phạm Văn Xanh, and Master Lưu Đức Trực, who delayed their return and accordingly sentenced to the lash by Your Majesty. Other people who have been hardworking at sea deserve the bonus of 1 month's salary per soldier and 2 cents per laborer. So that was a text, official text about compensation to people who were sent on mission on the Paracels. And then the French came, and they continued to exercise sovereignty over the Paracel and Spratleys. They sent people there to establish permanent garrisons, and they built different structures like flagpoles, steles, teletext transmission, weather stations there. In 1956, the French were replaced by South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam, and they also continued to exercise sovereignty over the Paracel and the Spratleys. And most importantly, they tried to defend the sovereignty of Vietnam over these two archipelagos, both by deeds and by words. For instance, in 1974, when China tried to seize the Paracels, the Republic of Vietnam fought back. And when they failed, they took the matter to the United Nations Security Council. In 1976, Vietnam became unified under the government of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam continued to exercise sovereignties over the Spratleys. They sent troops there, they continue to build infrastructures until today. Today, the Spratleys is administrated as a local district of Vietnam, and different modern infrastructures have been built there to serve the livelihood of people there. For instance, schools, pagoda, clinics, and just to let you know, many Vietnamese babies have been born in the Spratleys. And at the same time, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam continued to affirm sovereignty over the Paracels and continue to affirm that the Paracel and the Spratly dispute will be resolved based on peaceful means according to international law. Now let's come back to the original question. What are the impacts of the San Francisco Treaty on the status of Vietnam's sovereignty over the Paracels and Spratlys? And the answer is, Mr. Chair, can you see anything?
We could follow up to now, but now it's blank. It's just a white
You see
sheet.
nothing, right?
No.
Yeah, you see nothing simply because there's no impact whatsoever from the San Francisco Treaty to the status of sovereignty of Vietnam with Paracels and Spratlys. With or without the San Francisco Treaty, the sovereignty of Vietnam over the Paracels and Spratlys have long been established. It what the Prime Minister of the State of Vietnam, which became later Republic of Vietnam, Trần Văn Hữu, said at the San Francisco Conference in 1951. He said, as we must frankly profit from all the opportunities offered to us to stifle the germ of discord, we affirm our right to the Spratly and Paracel Islands, which have always belonged to Vietnam. Now, let me take some minutes to talk about Prime Minister Phạm Văn Đồng letter to Prime Minister Zhou Enlai of China. First, here is the whole content of the note. I can read it to you. Comrade Prime Minister, we have the honor to bring to your knowledge that the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam recognizes and supports the declaration dated the 4th September 1958 of the government of the People's Republic of China fixing the right of the Chinese territorial waters. The government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam respects this decision and will give instruction to its state bodies to respect the 12 nautical mile right of the territorial waters of China in all their relations in the maritime field with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. I address to you, Comrade Prime Minister, the assurance of my distinguished consideration. It's nothing about Spratly, nothing about Paracels. I don't see anything about that or historical right of China here. Actually, I think that Mr. Kaucha, as a peace-loving person or as a patriotic person, I think you should honor, respect, and veneer the letter of the Prime Minister Phạm Văn Đồng. You know why? Because, let me explain to you with background. At that time, the 7th Fleet of the United States was threatening China in the Taiwan Strait. So it is an act of good willingness from Vietnam, from Prime Minister Phạm Văn Đồng to his comrade Zhou Enlai in order to show Vietnam support of one China policy. I know that Chinese people have the tradition of being respectful of their brother, their friends. So I think that the Chinese people who lived in the 1950s, they will be very upset, very sad if they know that the letter of Prime Minister Phạm Văn Đồng is used, or I must say misused, in order to show discord between the two nations. That is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vo Hai Dong, for this presentation. We have got a Chinese perspective, a Vietnamese perspective, and light has been thrown on many historical events. We may discuss how much we can learn from these events for the present and for the future. That can be part of the discussion now. We have got at least 3 questions for different participants. I will ask you to be brief in your answers so that we can accommodate as many questions as possible. The first question is for Bill Hayton. It's from Noah Murdoch, who says, you discussed the impact of historical mapping on the potential Chinese claims to the Paracels Islands prior to 1909. Then comes the questions. Overall, how important has the historical mapping of the South China Sea region been in securing other claims in the region? Or would you argue that there are other sources which are more effective in this purpose? So the question is on mapping, the importance of mapping versus other sources of information. Please, Bill Hayton.
Okay, thank you. I think the important thing to say is that maps aren't proof of any historic, legal claim. I mean, anybody can make a map. It doesn't mean anything. When it comes to international law, what matters is whether you stick a flag in the ground or you build a lighthouse or carry out some act of administration. But that said, in terms of the process of how the claims advanced and the political and cultural side, then yes, the maps were very important. I mean, the Europeans made maps, starting in the sort of 17th century, and they were relying a lot on local knowledge, to do that. And then in the 19th century, they acquired their own surveying capabilities, and that obviously led to the start of the European claims. And then when, as I've tried to argue in some of my research, that the Chinese claim in the early part of the 20th century develops off the back of Western maps. And so you see maps being translated into Chinese and misinterpreted, and that leads to the extension of the Chinese claim. I'm doing a bit of research on the Vietnamese claim at the moment, and I would argue that that the process of French mapping in the 1920s and 30s was an important part of the development of the French and then the Vietnamese claim. And Gerald Saskis has he's written about that quite extensively. So yeah, I mean, maps don't prove anything, but they are an important part of the historical process of developing a claim.
Thanks so much. Next question is from Dao Nguyen, who says, I have a question for Carl Shah. From the Chinese perspective, whether and to what extent does the concept of Tianxia affect the view of China on the sovereign of a nation state and South China Sea issues? Maybe you can also, Carl Shah, explain what's meant by Tianxia. How does that? Yeah, please.
Tianxia is a Chinese term called all under heaven, and in the classical times, the Chinese ruler often asserts sovereignty over Tianxia or all under heaven. This is actually a very easy question, so I thank you for that. The answer is no. No, the concept of Tianxia does not affect view of China on the sovereignty of nation state and South China Sea issue.
That was a very, very short and very clear question. That's what some people really want from politicians. Clear answers, yes or no. Answer here is no. Thanks. Next speaker is Kien Nyap Pham, who says he or she wants to ask questions to Carl Shah and Dr. Hayton. I guess you can take the floor. Please try.
Greeting everyone. My name is Nga, and I'm one of the young leaders in the program. So I want to ask Mr. Jia and Dr. Hayton, because both of you have provided a lot of evidences and claims, and both claimants and non-claimants have always been arguing over the true history of the island. So the question is, first of all, how do you evaluate the legitimacy of the evidence or claims? And second, in case of dispute, how do these claims and evidence will weigh compared to the international laws, especially the UNCLOS? So my question have two parts, and thank you for answering.
Thank you so much. I think this question in reality goes to the entire panel. So whoever wants to come up with an answer, please try. Please come forward. You may start, Bill Hayton, if you wish, but whoever wants to.
I think there are kind of two kinds of claims that are made often, well, South China Sea, but maybe more generally. There are emotional claims, and then there are claims based on evidence. There are claims based on belief that somehow piece of territory or whatever is rightfully belonging to country or something like that. And then there's what you can actually prove in terms of documents. And a good example of how you can solve these things is the dispute over the little rock of Pedra Branca between Singapore and Malaysia, down in the Straits of Singapore, when it all depended on colonial documents and which state had built a lighthouse and that kind of thing. Exactly the same procedures could be used in terms of the South China Sea as well. And you just need evidence. You just need something. So if somebody wants to say that China objected to the French claim to the Spratlys in 1933, well, just produce a piece of paper that proves that. There is no evidence, as far as I know, that there's evidence the other way, that the Chinese government decided that it didn't have a claim to the Spratlys in 1933 and therefore didn't protest. But sometimes it's always harder to prove a negative. But the assertion that simply because China claims the Spratlys now that it always claimed them, it isn't supported by evidence. And so therefore people kind of reach to kind of irrelevant things like whether a piece of pottery was found on an island, doesn't say anything about who put it there, or whether there was any act of administration, whether it was a shipwreck, whether it was a Malay vessel, all that kind of stuff. That speaks to an emotional claim, not to a legal claim.
Before I give the floor to the others, let me add a question which also goes into this, and that is simply how important should we consider historical claims for the present? I mean, there is hardly any square meter on the planet which cannot be claimed by different nations. I mean, Germany didn't exist 150 years back. United States of America was established on some other people's land. The borders of China for sure is maybe the same as during Qing dynasty, but it's not the same as the borders of the Han or the Tang dynasty. So there is no square meter of land which cannot be claimed by different. I was working in the peace process in Sri Lanka for many years, and Tamils and Sinhalese came to me with claims based on the writings of Buddha 2,500 years back, and claiming that this or that time this island was either Sinhalese or Tamil. But the issue is how should we judge historical claims in the present? How important are historical claims for peaceful resolution of disputes today? I leave this question lingering, but whoever wants to answer that, or the question from the young Vietnamese leader, please come forward.
I'd like to take a minute to answer the question since it was also addressed to me. I'm of the view that's closer to the former U.S. Ambassador Chas Freeman. On that, I think the claimants can present views from 1,000 years to a few hundred years back all they want, but we have to have a standard, right? The standard is now everyone function on the model of nation state, on the Westphalian model as you will. And according to Chas, the former ambassador Chas Freeman, he said it doesn't really matter which sailor at what times used to use these islands at some point 5,000 years in the past. But what in this case, China is the first to assert the sovereignty in the modern sense. And there's evidence, like there's a 1909 expedition, which I pointed out, and there's also the 1946 the expedition and the Chinese garrison of the islands. I mean Taiwan, the KMT government of Taiwan government garrison on Ituaba is still there. It has been there since 1950s, and so is the Chinese garrison on the Yongxin Island in the Paracel. So I mean, these are the facts that's harder to dispute. And I also try not to quote too many Chinese sources because I know people will cast their doubt. That's why I quoted mostly from Western sources. So that's my spiel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl Shaw. Wu Haidang, you have a perspective on this?
Yes. Just to follow up on what Carl said, I have two comments. The first is the reason why the French didn't protest against Admiral Legend expedition in 1909, because the French didn't think that it was worthy to protest. It wasn't for them, it was for the French, it wasn't considered as an act of sovereignty. In order to establish sovereignty, you have to follow a certain protocol. You said, you pointed out rightly, certain standard. And you know, just going there and fire some short cannons for the French wasn't, and for the protocol at the time, wasn't considered enough as a protocol to establish sovereignty. And my second comment is, since you said you didn't want to quote much Chinese source, I can show to you one Chinese source that I think quite interesting. Can I share my screen?
Please.
Okay. It's amazing you can find anything on internet today. Give me some second. Oh. Okay. Yeah. So it's on Wikipedia, but I think you can find it on authoritative source as well. Sulian, or I think it's the name Chinese is Sulian, or Su Taoshan, he was a monk, a very famous monk, who was invited by the kings of Vietnam to visit Vietnam in the 17th century. And when he came back, he wrote a book named Overseas Chronicles. Can you see it here? I can't read Chinese, so I translate it to English. Yeah. So the book is about what he saw and what he viewed in Vietnam and during a trip to Vietnam. He wrote that when he came back to China. And I think in one of the page of the book, you will find he write about the sovereignty of the Nguyen dynasty in the Paracels. I can read it to you. Just take a few seconds. So he wrote, because there are sandbanks which run parallel to the coast, from northeast to southwest, the tall ones are as high as a wall, but the short ones are at level of the sea. The surface of the sand is at heart of iron. Unfortunate ships running into them would break into pieces. The sandbank is hundreds of miles wide, limitlessly long, called 100-mile long sand, or Vạn Lý Trường Sa in Vietnamese. It's another name for paracel in Vietnamese. No tree, no house. If ships struck by bad wind and run into here, if not broken, with no rice, no water, the sailors, you certainly become hungry ghosts. The distance from this area to Đại Việt, which is the name of Vietnam at the time, would take about 7 days of traveling, or about 700 miles. Its previous king, that is important, the previous king every year has sent ships to fish in these sandbanks to collect gold and equipment of wrecked ships drifting into this area. So that is a Chinese document written by a Chinese relatively famous monk at that time, which testify the activity of sovereignty by the Vietnamese kings and Nguyen kings in the Paracels and the treaties at that time. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Gemlier-Gendreau, you want to add something? Can you hear me? If not, I will ask you to consider the importance of, oh, please. Okay. I will come back to my question, because I mean, working on conflict resolution in many parts of the planet, I tend to take the view that it will be very, very difficult to get a complete agreement on what happened in history and the importance of the different claims. But let's assume that we were in the position that everyone would agree on the history. How much would it mean for the present? In my continent, Europe, of course, borders today are completely different from the borders of, say, 1910, which is at the center of some of these historical claims in the South China Sea. I mean, borders in Europe are absolutely different from borders of that time. And people still accept the borders of today without basically any real disputes. So my question is, how much should we judge, or how much emphasis should we put on historical claims versus finding pragmatic solutions in the present, which can satisfy the main claimants as much as possible. Even if we were to agree on the history, will give us the direction we need.
Shall I say something?
Wuhadan, or yeah, whoever wants. Please, Bill Hayton.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling on this is that the problem is that when people talk about the claims to everything, the claims to all the Spratlys, all the Paracels, all the islands, you know, in one chunk, it's clear from the evidence that different states stuck their flags in different bits of rock at different times. And so what we need to do is accept that there's a varied history and accept that there's a need to compromise, and basically accept the situation as it is now. I mean, that's my broad position. And I think this needs to start with the Southeast Asians, that the, you know, Vietnam and the Philippines need to, and Malaysia need to recognize each other's occupations and commit to not extending their claims. And then basically the ball, you know, is then looking, you know, why is China being so aggressive and assuming that it's the sole owner based on rather tendentious historical claims? Disaggregate them, break them up, just as the ICJ did in the Pedra Branca case and found 3 different outcomes for 3 different bits of rock that are within 2 miles of each other. The same process could happen in the South China Sea.
I understand, Professor Monique Chemelier-Jandreau, that you have asked the floor. I tried to give it to you in the past, but if you can, please take the floor. Madame.
Oui. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je suis heureuse d'intervenir dans un débat dans lequel se trouve un collègue chinois, parce que c'est en discutant qu'on peut avancer, et nous devons avancer sur la base des normes du droit international qui sont les normes communes à la communauté des nations. Ces règles de droit international en matière de territoire, il a été rappelé le résultat de l'affaire de l'île de Palmas, qui est une des premières à fixer les règles en matière de territoire de ce genre. Il y a 2 critères en droit international, c'est l'antériorité du titre de souveraineté et l'effectivité de l'administration du territoire. Ce sont les 2 critères qui permettent en droit international, notamment devant les juridictions internationales, de trancher les questions de souveraineté lorsqu'elles sont litigieuses. Alors, sur la question de l'antériorité, notre collègue Karlza a parlé des poteries, par exemple. Mais moi, dans mes recherches, j'ai trouvé les documents relatifs à l'administration par les empereurs d'Annam, avec des décrets impériaux fixant la composition des équipes de marins qui devaient y aller, donnant des récompenses et des décorations à ceux qui revenaient par la suite, donnant des ordres, par exemple, de planter des arbres dans certaines îles, de relever le cadastre. Enfin, j'ai trouvé des actes d'administration effective remontant au moins au XVIIe et XVIIIe siècle. Quand notre collègue nous parle de poteries trouvées dans les îles, les poteries, ça c'est le fait. On peut trouver des poteries parce qu'il y avait des pêcheurs privés, car l'administration par un État n'empêche pas certaines de ces îles d'être fréquentées par des pêcheurs privés. Et la fréquentation par les pêcheurs privés de toutes les nationalités bordant ce territoire, ça n'est pas en soi une preuve de souveraineté. Donc moi, je travaille sur la question de la preuve de souveraineté avec ces 2 critères, l'antériorité et l'effectivité. Et c'est pour ça que j'ai conclu dans mes travaux pour l'instant que ce titre était celui du Vietnam, qui ensuite a été relayé par la France. C'est vrai que la Chine a fait des protestations de souveraineté à partir de 1909, nous les avons, nous les connaissons bien, mais c'était des déclarations postérieures à des actes de souveraineté qui avaient été reconnus, d'une part, et d'autre part, ce sont des actes de déclaration en 1909 qui n'ont pas été suivis d'occupation effective. Voilà, donc moi, ma question à mon collègue chinois, Elle est depuis longtemps. Je suis allée à Pékin, j'ai eu des discussions toujours sur le même thème. Pourquoi la Chine refuse-t-elle d'aller devant les juridictions internationales, ce qui serait une occasion de mettre sur la table les éléments dont disposent les uns et les autres pour que l'affaire soit mise au clair par des juges indépendants. Merci.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think we are soon coming to a close for this session, but of course, Carl Shaw, you will have the floor to respond to what Professor said, and I will call upon Wu Haidong to make a last comment before we close this session. Please, Carl Shaw.
Okay, so first I like to say, respond to your question, which is about the resolution of the current conflict. My view is actually not that different from either Bill Hyten or Professor Monique. But first, I need to state that I do not represent the Chinese government. I'm not even a Chinese citizen, right? I'm just a person of Chinese heritage here as an independent researcher to stating my views. Okay, now having said that caveat, I believe there are certain international laws that could set us a standard. All the claimants, all the South China Sea claimants, they're all signatory to the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention. And that is a basis from which they can work on. And as Bill said, at the present, the occupation of the island is already a matter of fact. You know, different countries already occupy a specific piece of rock. It's probably just realistic to recognize that as a fact and go from there. And from there, based on the United Nations law of the sea, we can say, okay, you have this rock, you have this 12 nautical meters around you as a territorial sea, but whereas you have maybe things are different for say the island that's considered to be humanly habitable. That would be the Ituaba or the Taiping Island, and the Yongxin Island or the Woody Island on the Paracels, because then those islands actually entitle their own exclusive EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, right? So, and now to respond to Professor Monique, well, I already stated I don't represent the Chinese government position, but I just like to remind both Dr. Wu Haidong and Monique that China did exercise the sovereignty unchallenged, the one time in 1909 and also in 1946, immediately after World War II. China sailed to these islands, they put up their stone markers. Those are the assertion of sovereignty. And then the garrison, Chinese garrison did leave in 1950 because of the Chinese Civil War. The KMT garrison withdrew from Woody and Spratly briefly, and these are documented facts. There's no, I mean you can look it up. And then they're reoccupied in 1956. It was due to the claim by the Filipino businessman Tomas Clamas, who wanted to claim all of South China Sea to himself. So the fact that all the Chinese activity during all this time went unchallenged, you know, you can't, it's kind of hard to argue for your assertion of unbroken control over these islands. But having said that, I agree, you know, the best thing forward is to recognize the fact and be realistic and recognize that each country already has its position. There's no need to fight over it. You know, the important thing is peace and stability, and from there, you know, maybe because maybe they can look at the example of Malaysia and Brunei, because they actually have overlapping claims, but these two countries are able to work together and jointly explore the resources. And my wish is for Vietnam, China, and Philippines can actually come together and agree to share the resources in South China Sea instead of fighting over it. That's my statement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl Shaw. I cannot underline more what you said. No one here is representing any government as far as I'm concerned. No one is representing the Chinese or the Vietnamese, for sure not the colonial powers of the United Kingdom or France. So we just have interesting conversation between individuals with different views and interesting perspectives on this part of the world. Wu Haidang, you want the last final comment?
Thank you, Chair. I just make a very short comment. First, I think that I totally agree. For once, I totally agree with Carl that we need to resolve the sovereignty disputes peacefully and based on international law. And I think Vietnamese government has formulated the claim of Vietnam based on international law. So I hope that, other claimants can do the same as well. It's going to be easier for us to resolve the dispute if you do it that way. And I also want to join Carl to really wish that in the future, the South China Sea dispute, including the parcel in the Spratly dispute, could be resolved peacefully. And I would like to raise my glass for that. Cheers. Just water, but hopefully one day it's going to be champagne. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and let's come together in Singapore or in Hanoi to have a champagne at some point in the future. Let me end this very interesting session with one of the wisest persons I can even think of, and that's the great Supreme Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, who had a perspective on the Taiwan crisis, which I think the entire world can learn from when it comes to conflict resolution. And that was when he said that, of course, he repeated the Chinese one China policy and the Chinese view that Taiwan is a part of China. But then he said, this conflict is too complicated. We will not be able to resolve it in one generation. If we try to force a resolution now, it will just complicate the matters. Let's leave it to the next generation who may be wiser than ours to find a solution. In the meantime, we work together, we extend people-to-people relations, we prioritize economic development, and I think this view have served China very, very well for a generation. And I think it's a good recipe for conflict resolutions in many parts of the world. We should not try to force immediate resolution on complicated matters, but try to find ways in a pragmatic way to work together for the future. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Carl Shah, Bill Hayton, Professor Chemelier Gendreau, and Wu Haidang. Thank you for your perspectives. I've learned a lot from listening to you, and I hope we will have opportunities to work together in the future for peaceful resolution of issues in the South China Sea and indeed in this rapidly rising part of the planet called Southeast Asia, which is so important for all of us. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.